"Can you buy this medicine?" begged the little girl until the lonely Lakota looked up and gasped in shock. For in her desperate brown eyes, he saw the face of a woman he'd loved and lost 20 years ago. A woman who'd vanished without a trace, carrying his unborn child. And now this trembling child stood before him, clutching a bottle of laudanum with hands that bore the unmistakable birthmark of his bloodline. The dusty streets of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, shimmered under the merciless August sun of 1895, where the air hung thick with the scent of sagebrush and the lingering smoke from the copper smelters that gave the town its name. Adobe buildings baked like clay ovens, and the only sounds were the distant hammering from the mine shafts, and the occasional snort of horses tied to weathered hitching posts outside the general store. Here, in this forgotten corner of the territorial frontier, where Apache raids were still fresh in memory and the railroad had bypassed them for more profitable routes, the town survived on copper ore, stubborn pride, and the kind of silence that came when people learned to mind their own business.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
William Will Black Wolf sat motionless on the wooden bench outside Garrett's Mercantile, his weathered hands resting on his knees as he watched the street with the patient stillness of a man who had learned to see everything while revealing nothing. At 43, his face bore the sharp cheekbones and bronze skin of his Lakota heritage, though his hair was cut short in the white man style and his clothes were those of any other territorial drifter. Denim pants worn soft with age, a cotton shirt faded from too many washings, and boots that had walked more miles than most men traveled in a lifetime completed his appearance. His dark eyes held depths that spoke of loss and wandering, of a man who belonged fully to neither the world of his father's people nor his mother's, caught forever between two cultures that each claimed half his soul. Will had been sitting on that same bench for 3 hours, waiting for the weekly supply wagon that might or might not arrive before sunset, hoping it would carry the medicine he needed for his infected knife wound that refused to heal properly. He'd ridden into Copper Ridge 2 days ago, his horse lame and his body burning with fever, seeking medical attention in a town where the only doctor was a drunk, and the pharmacist viewed Indians with the kind of suspicion that made every transaction a negotiation. But the waiting didn't bother him anymore. Patience had become his greatest skill during 20 years of wandering from one frontier town to another, taking whatever work he could find, never staying long enough to form attachments that might complicate his carefully maintained solitude. The Mercantile's wooden doors creaked open behind him, and he heard the familiar shuffle of boots and the jingle of spurs as another customer emerged into the oppressive heat. Will didn't turn to look. He'd learned long ago that curiosity was a luxury he couldn't afford, especially in towns where his mixed heritage made him an object of both fascination and distrust. But then he heard it, a small voice, high and desperate, cutting through the afternoon stillness like a knife. "Excuse me, mister, can you buy this medicine?" Will's head turned slowly, instinctively, and what he saw made the blood freeze in his veins. Standing in the shade of the Mercantile's wooden overhang was a little girl, no more than 6 or 7 years old, with long black hair that caught the light like polished obsidian and skin the color of desert sand at twilight. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been mended multiple times, her small feet encased in boots that were clearly too large for her, and in her tiny hands she clutched a brown glass bottle labeled with the distinctive script of Dr. Morrison's laudanum. But it wasn't the medicine that stopped Will's heart. It was her face. The delicate features, the shape of her eyes, the way she held her small chin with unconscious pride. This child looked exactly like Isabella Martinez had looked 20 years ago, when she was 7 years old and living with her grandmother in the Mexican settlement outside Fort Apache. Isabella, who had grown into the most beautiful woman Will had ever seen, with eyes like midnight stars and a laugh that could chase away the deepest sorrows. Isabella, who had loved him despite the hatred between their peoples, who had carried his child beneath her heart when she vanished one terrible night in 1875, leaving behind only questions that had haunted him for 2 decades. "What did you say, little one?" Will asked, his voice coming out rougher than he intended, thick with emotions he thought he'd buried along with his hopes of ever finding the answers he sought. The child stepped closer, her small bare feet making no sound on the wooden planks of the boardwalk. Up close, Will could see the exhaustion in her young face, the way her shoulders trembled slightly despite the oppressive heat. Her dress was clean but faded, mended with careful stitches that spoke of loving hands and limited resources. Around her neck hung a small silver cross on a leather cord, and on her left wrist was a braided bracelet made from horsehair and colored beads in the traditional Lakota pattern his grandmother had taught him as a boy. "I asked if you could buy this medicine for my mama," Luna said, her voice barely above a whisper. She held up the brown bottle, and Will could see that her small hands were shaking. "Mr. Garrett says I need $3, but I only have 50 cents. Mama gave me all the money we have, but it's not enough, and she's getting sicker every day." Will looked at the bottle in her hands, recognizing the distinctive label of laudanum, the opium-based pain medicine that had become both blessing and curse on the frontier. It was expensive, often more costly than a family could afford, and in a town like Copper Ridge where the pharmacist held a monopoly on medical supplies, desperation often met with cold calculation rather than compassion. "Where is your mama now?" Will asked gently, crouching down so that his eyes were level with hers. The movement sent a sharp pain through his infected wound, but he ignored it, focusing instead on the child's face, searching for more clues to the mystery that seemed to be unfolding before him. "She's at our camp, about 2 miles north of town, by the old mining claim near Coyote Creek," Luna replied. "She sent me to town to try to get the medicine because she can't walk anymore. Her leg got hurt real bad when our horse spooked and kicked her, and now it's all swollen and hot to touch. She tries not to cry, but I hear her at night when she thinks I'm sleeping." Will felt his chest tighten with a familiar ache. He'd seen too many people suffer in silence on the frontier, too many families struggling alone with injuries and illnesses that proper medical care could easily treat. But there was something more here, something in the way this child spoke, in the careful way she chose her words, that suggested she was older than her years, forced to grow up too quickly by circumstances beyond her control. "What's your name, child?" Will asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer, afraid of what it might confirm about the wild hope that was beginning to grow in his chest like a flame in dry kindling. "Luna Martinez," she said, and the name hit Will like a physical blow. Martinez, Isabella's family name. The name he'd whispered in his prayers for 20 years, hoping against hope that someday he would find some trace of the woman who had vanished with his heart and his unborn child. Will's hands began to tremble as he reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small leather pouch containing his traveling money. $3 was more than he could easily afford to spare, especially with his own medical needs, but looking into Luna's desperate eyes, he knew he had no choice. If there was even the smallest chance that this child was connected to Isabella, he had to help. He had to know. "Here," he said, pressing the coins into Luna's small palm. "This should be enough for the medicine." Luna's eyes went wide with shock and gratitude. For a moment, she simply stared at the money in her hand as if she couldn't believe it was real. Then she looked up at Will with an expression that nearly broke his heart, a mixture of relief and hope that spoke of too many prayers that had gone unanswered. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Mama always says that the spirits send help when we need it most, but I was starting to think they'd forgotten about us." Will watched as Luna carefully tucked the money into a small cloth pouch tied to her dress. Every movement she made reminded him of Isabella, the same graceful gestures, the same unconscious dignity, even in desperate circumstances.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The resemblance was too strong to be coincidence, too precise to be explained by chance. "Luna," Will said carefully, "what's your mama's name?" "Isabella," Luna replied without hesitation. "Isabella Martinez. She used to live near Fort Apache when she was young, but she doesn't like to talk about those days much. She says some memories are too heavy to carry, so it's better to focus on today and tomorrow." The words confirmed what Will's heart had already known. This was Isabella's daughter. This child, with her familiar features and unconscious mannerisms, was living proof that the woman he'd loved had survived whatever tragedy had taken her away from him 20 years ago. But the revelation brought as many questions as answers. Why had Isabella never tried to contact him? Why was she living alone with her daughter in an isolated mining camp, struggling to survive when she could have returned to her family or sought help from the Indian agencies? Will stood slowly, his mind racing with possibilities and plans. He needed to see Isabella, needed to understand what had happened and why she had chosen to disappear so completely from his life. But he also sensed that approaching this situation required delicacy, that there were layers of pain and history here that he didn't yet understand. "Luna," he said, "I'd like to help your mama in any way I can. Would it be all right if I rode out to your camp with some additional supplies? Food, maybe some blankets?" Luna's face brightened with hope, but then quickly clouded with worry. "Mama doesn't usually like strangers coming to the camp. She's very careful about who she trusts. But if you're the one who helped buy her medicine, maybe she'll listen." Will nodded, understanding Isabella's caution. A woman alone with a child on the frontier had to be suspicious of everyone, especially men whose intentions might not be honorable. The fact that she'd been living in isolation for so long suggested that she'd learned to rely only on herself, a lesson that was both admirable and heartbreaking. "Tell your mama that my name is Will Black Wolf, and that I knew her family at Fort Apache many years ago," Will said. "Tell her I'd like to help, but only if she's comfortable with it. I'll wait in town for her answer." Luna nodded solemnly, as if she understood the weight of the message she was being asked to deliver. She clutched the medicine bottle tightly to her chest and turned toward the edge of town where Will could see a small pinto pony tied to a mesquite tree. The animal was old and sway-backed, but it appeared well cared for despite its obvious age. "Thank you again, Mr. Black Wolf," Luna said. "I'll tell Mama what you said. Maybe she'll remember you from the old days." As Will watched Luna climb carefully onto her pony and ride slowly out of town, his mind was already working through the implications of this unexpected encounter. For 20 years he'd carried the weight of unanswered questions about Isabella's disappearance. He'd searched for her across 3 territories, following rumors and false leads that always ended in disappointment. He'd imagined countless scenarios from tragedy to betrayal, but he'd never stopped hoping that someday he would find the truth. Now, sitting on the bench outside Garrett's Mercantile, as the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty street, Will realized that the truth might be more complicated than anything he'd imagined. Isabella was alive, but she was struggling. She had a daughter who bore Will's own tribal markings and resembled her mother so strongly that there could be no doubt about her parentage. But why had Isabella chosen isolation over asking for help? What had happened during those terrible days in 1875 that had driven her to disappear so completely? As the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Will made a decision that would change the course of his carefully ordered life. He would not ride away from Copper Ridge as he had from so many other towns. He would not add this encounter to his collection of brief connections and missed opportunities. This time he would stay. This time he would fight for the chance to understand what had been lost and what might still be saved. The next morning brought with it a tension that seemed to hang in the air like the smoke from the copper smelters. Will had spent a restless night in the boarding house, his mind churning with memories of Isabella and questions about what the next few hours might bring. He'd purchased supplies at first light: coffee, flour, salt pork, and a bottle of carbolic acid for cleaning wounds. If Isabella's injury was as serious as Luna had described, she would need more than laudanum to heal properly. Will was loading the supplies onto his horse when he heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats. He turned to see Luna riding slowly down the main street, her small figure dwarfed by the empty buildings and the vast sky above. But she wasn't alone. Walking beside her pony was a woman who made Will's breath catch in his throat: Isabella. Martinez had changed in 20 years, as any person would, but the essence of her remained unmistakable. Her long black hair was now streaked with silver and pulled back in a practical braid. Lines around her eyes spoke of years, spent squinting against the desert sun and weathering hardships that would have broken lesser spirits. She moved with a noticeable limp, favoring her right leg, and Will could see the pain she was trying to hide with each careful step. But her posture remained proud, her chin lifted with the same unconscious dignity that had first captured his heart 2 decades ago. When their eyes met across the dusty street, the years seemed to collapse like a house of cards. Will saw recognition flicker across Isabella's face, followed immediately by a complex mixture of emotions: surprise, fear, longing, and something that might have been relief. For a long moment, neither of them moved, both caught in the gravity of a reunion they had perhaps dreamed of, but never truly expected. Isabella spoke first, her voice carrying across the morning air with the same musical quality that had haunted Will's dreams for 20 years. "William Black Wolf, Luna told me you were here, but I couldn't quite believe it was true." Will stepped forward slowly, conscious that any sudden movement might spook Isabella into fleeing again. "Isabella, you look well, considering what Luna told me about your injury." A wry smile touched Isabella's lips. "You always were too polite for your own good. I look like a woman who's been living rough for 20 years, and we both know it. But thank you for helping Luna yesterday. The medicine has already begun to ease the pain." Will noticed how carefully Isabella positioned herself, using Luna's pony for support while trying to appear strong and independent. Pride, he realized, had always been both her greatest strength and her most dangerous weakness. It was pride that had made her refuse to marry him when her family disapproved of their relationship. Pride that had driven her to prove she could survive anything life threw at her. And probably pride that had kept her from seeking help all these years. "Luna mentioned you're camping near Coyote Creek," Will said. "That's rough country for a woman and child to be living alone." Isabella's chin lifted defensively. "We manage. We've been managing just fine for years. This injury is temporary, nothing more." But Luna, still mounted on her pony, looked between the two adults with the perceptive eyes of a child who had learned to read situations quickly. "Mama, your leg has been getting worse for weeks, not better. And we're almost out of food again." Isabella shot her daughter a warning look, but Luna continued with the kind of honesty that only children possessed. "Mr. Black Wolf, my mama is the strongest person I know, but she needs help right now, even if she won't say so. The medicine you bought is helping with the pain, but the infection is spreading. I can see it getting bigger every day." Will felt his heart clench at the child's words. Infection was a killer on the frontier, especially when it was left untreated. He'd seen strong men die from wounds that started as minor cuts, their bodies slowly poisoned by bacteria they couldn't fight. The thought of Isabella suffering the same fate, especially when he had the knowledge and supplies to help her, was unbearable. "Isabella," Will said carefully, "I have some medical supplies with me: carbolic acid, clean bandages. I've had some experience treating infected wounds from my time with the cavalry. Would you let me take a look?" Isabella's expression hardened. "I don't need charity, Will. I never did. This isn't charity," Will replied firmly. This is one human being helping another. It's what any decent person would do, for a moment. The street was silent except for the distant sound of hammers from the mine and the soft snorting of horses. Isabella stared at Will with an intensity that seemed to be weighing not just his offer, but 20 years of history between them. Finally, she nodded slowly. All right. But we do this at our camp, on my terms. And if I decide I want you to leave, you go without argument. Will nodded immediately. Agreed. Whatever makes you most comfortable. The ride to Isabella and Luna's camp took them through some of the most desolate country Will had seen in years of frontier wandering. The trail wound through stands of mesquite and palo verde, past abandoned mining claims marked only by rusting equipment and holes carved into the hillsides like wounds in the earth. The August heat was merciless, but Isabella rode without complaint. Though Will could see the effort it cost her to stay upright in the saddle. Their camp, when they finally reached it, was both impressive and heartbreaking in its resourcefulness. Isabella had chosen a spot near a small spring, where cottonwood trees provided precious shade and the sound of running water created an oasis of peace in the harsh landscape. A canvas tarp stretched between trees served as shelter, while carefully arranged rocks formed a fire pit and cooking area. Everything was clean and organized, but the poverty was unmistakable. This was the camp of people who had learned to make do with almost nothing. Luna immediately busied herself caring for the horses while Isabella lowered herself carefully onto a flat rock near the fire pit. In the dappled shade of the cottonwoods, Will could see just how serious her injury really was. Her right leg was badly swollen from knee to ankle, and dark streaks radiating from what appeared to be a deep puncture. Wound spoke of a dangerous infection that was spreading through her system. Isabella, Will said quietly, this needs immediate attention. How long has it been since the injury occurred? 3 weeks, Isabella admitted reluctantly. Maybe 4. I've been trying to treat it with willow bark tea and hot compresses, but it keeps getting worse. Will knelt beside her and began unpacking his medical supplies. I need to clean this wound thoroughly and apply carbolic acid. It's going to hurt, but it's the only way to stop the infection from spreading further, Isabella nodded grimly. Do what you have to do. I've endured worse. As Will began the delicate process of cleaning and treating Isabella's infected wound, Luna sat nearby, watching with the careful attention of a child who had become accustomed to being her mother's primary caretaker. The trust she showed in Will's abilities was both touching and sobering. This little girl had placed her mother's life in the hands of a man she'd met only yesterday, based on nothing more than an act of kindness and her mother's willingness to accept help. Working on Isabella's injury gave Will the opportunity to study her face more closely, to catalog the changes that 20 years had wrought. The girl he'd fallen in love with had become a woman of remarkable strength, her beauty refined by hardship into something more complex and enduring. But there were shadows in her eyes that spoke of sorrows he couldn't begin to imagine, experiences that had shaped her in ways he was only beginning to understand. There, Will said finally, securing a clean bandage around Isabella's leg. The carbolic acid should help fight the infection, but you need to keep the wound elevated and change the dressing twice daily. And you need rest, real rest, not the kind where you're constantly worried about survival. Isabella looked down at the professionally wrapped bandage, then back at Will. Thank you. I know this couldn't have been easy, given everything that's happened between us. Will sat back on his heels, studying her face. Isabella, we need to talk about what happened 20 years ago. About why you disappeared. About Luna. Isabella's expression immediately became guarded. Some things are better left in the past, Will. Not this, Will said firmly. Not when it involves a child who bears my family's markings and has eyes that could be looking back at me from my own reflection. Luna is my daughter, isn't she? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. And Will watched as Isabella's carefully maintained composure began to crack. The silence that followed Will's question stretched like a taut rope ready. Toe snap. Isabella's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the rock where she sat, her knuckles white against the weathered stone. Luna, sensing the sudden tension between the adults, moved closer to her mother with the instinctive protectiveness of a child who had learned early that the world could shift without warning. Yes, Isabella whispered finally, the word barely audible above the gentle murmur of the spring. Luna is your daughter. Will felt the confirmation hit him like a physical blow, even though he had already known the truth in his heart. Hearing Isabella speak the words aloud made it real in a way that observation and intuition could not. For 20 years he had wandered the frontier as a man alone, believing that his chance for family and legacy had died with Isabella's disappearance. Now sitting in the dappled shade of cottonwood trees beside a hidden spring, he discovered that he had a daughter who had grown up without ever knowing his name. Why? The word escaped from Will's throat like a wounded animal's cry. Why didn't you tell me? Why did you disappear without a word? Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. Because I had no choice. Because staying would have meant death for all of us. Luna looked between her parents with wide eyes, clearly understanding that she was witnessing something momentous but not yet grasping the full implications. Mama, is Mr. Black Wolf really my father? The father you always said was a good man but couldn't be with us? Isabella reached out and stroked her daughter's hair with infinite tenderness. Yes, Mia, this is your father. The man I've told you about in stories. Will stared at Luna with new eyes, seeing not just Isabella's features, but his own reflected back at him. The shape of her hands, the way she tilted her head when thinking, the unconscious dignity in her posture, all of it spoke of bloodlines that connected her to two proud peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. Tell me what happened, Will said, his voice rough with emotion. Tell me why you felt you had to choose between my life and our child's. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant as she gathered the threads of a story she had spent 20 years trying to forget. When she finally began to speak, her voice carried the weight of old pain and carefully guarded secrets. Do you remember the spring of 1875? When tensions were rising between the cavalry and the Apache bands? When Colonel Morrison was convinced that another uprising was imminent? Will nodded grimly. Those had been dark days at Fort Apache, with rumors of war councils and whispers of revenge for past massacres. The atmosphere had been thick with suspicion and fear, making every interaction between whites and Indians a potential flashpoint for violence. I was 3 months pregnant when my uncle, Captain Diego Martinez, discovered our relationship. Isabella continued. He was furious. Not just because you were part Lakota, but because he believed any association with Indians would destroy his military career. He'd worked for 15 years to overcome the prejudice against his Mexican heritage, and he wasn't going to let his niece's romance with a half-breed scout ruin everything he'd built. Will remembered Captain Martinez, a hard man who had clawed his way up through the ranks despite the discrimination that kept most Hispanic soldiers from advancing beyond enlisted positions. He had been ambitious, calculating, and utterly without sentiment when it came to anything that threatened his goals. But it wasn't just Uncle Diego's career at stake, Isabella continued, her voice growing harder. Colonel Morrison had been looking for any excuse to get rid of the Indian scouts. He believed they were security risks, potential spies who might feed information to hostile tribes. When Diego told him about us, Morrison saw his opportunity. What did he do? Will asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would be worse than anything he had imagined. Isabella's hands clenched into fists. He gave you a choice. Abandon your relationship with me and accept transfer to a cavalry unit in Montana, or face court-martial on charges of espionage and treason. He said he had witnesses who would swear they'd seen you passing information to Apache warriors during Your scouting missions will felt ice form in his veins. A court-martial on espionage charges in 1875 would have meant death by firing squad, especially for a man with Indian blood who was already viewed with suspicion by many in the military hierarchy. But that's not the worst part, Isabella continued, her voice breaking slightly. Morrison told Diego that if I didn't disappear voluntarily, he would make sure that both you and I were charged as conspirators. He said a pregnant Mexican woman carrying a half-breed's child would be easy to convict of passing secrets to hostile Indians. He promised that our baby would be born in prison and taken away immediately after birth. Luna had gone very still, her young face pale as she began to understand the magnitude of the forces that had shaped her family's history. Will wanted to reach out to her, to offer comfort, but he was still reeling from the revelation of just how completely they had all been betrayed. So you left to protect us, Will said slowly, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. You sacrificed your own safety and our future together to keep me from being executed and our child from being stolen. I had one night to decide, Isabella said, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. One night to choose between watching the man I love die for a crime he didn't commit, or disappearing forever to save his life. I chose to save you, even if it meant I could never see you again. Will stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the spring where the water bubbled up from hidden depths in the earth. The irony was crushing. Isabella had saved his life by destroying it, had preserved his future by taking away everything that made that future worth having. For 20 years, he had mourned her loss while living the life her sacrifice had made possible. Where did you go? He asked, turning back to face her. How did you survive? Isabella wiped her tears with the back of her hand, struggling to regain her composure. I took what little money I had and traveled south to my grandmother's people in Sonora. I told them I was a widow, that my husband had died in an Apache raid. My grandmother was suspicious, but she took me in anyway. Luna was born there, in a small village where no one asked too many questions about a woman alone. And you stayed there? Will pressed, trying to understand how the path that had brought her back to Arizona territory. For 10 years, Isabella replied. I worked as a seamstress and helped tend my grandmother's goats. Luna learned to speak Spanish and Yaqui from the village women. We had a simple life, but it was peaceful. Safe. Luna, who had been listening intently to her mother's story, spoke up for the first time in several minutes. But then Abuela died, and the men in the village started saying that Mama should remarry. They didn't like that she was raising me alone, Isabella nodded, her expression darkening. The village patriarch decided that Luna and I were becoming a burden without a man to provide for us. He tried to arrange a marriage between me and his eldest son, a man who made it clear that he considered Luna an unwelcome addition to any potential household. When I refused, he threatened to contact the Mexican authorities and have me investigated as a possible revolutionary sympathizer. So you ran again, Will said, understanding beginning to dawn. We headed north, back toward the border. Isabella confirmed. I thought maybe enough time had passed. Maybe the people who wanted to hurt us were dead, or had forgotten. We worked our way through mining camps and railroad towns, taking whatever honest work we could find. I was always careful to keep moving, never staying anywhere long enough to attract attention. We'll try to imagine Isabella and Luna as refugees, wandering from place to place with no permanent home, no community to rely on for support. Life of constant vigilance and insecurity must have been exhausting, especially for a woman trying to raise a child alone. But something went wrong recently, he observed. Something that brought you to this isolated camp instead of continuing to move. Isabella's face grew grim. We were working in a mining town called Silver Creek, about 60 miles east of here. I was cooking for the miners, and Luna was helping. The school teacher. We thought we might finally be able to settle down, maybe even stay for more than a few months. What happened? Will asked, though he suspected the answer would be another betrayal. Another reminder of how dangerous the world could be for people who existed on its margins. A new mine foreman arrived from back east, Isabella said bitterly. A man named Thomas Morrison, Colonel Morrison's nephew. He recognized me immediately, even after all those years. He threatened to wire his uncle and have federal marshals sent to arrest me on the old conspiracy charges. Will felt rage build in his chest like a bonfire. The Morrison family had already destroyed Isabella's life once, and now they were trying to do it again, using the same fabricated charges and manufactured evidence that had driven her away 20 years earlier. I gave him everything we had saved, Isabella continued. Every penny we'd managed to put aside for Luna's future. He promised that would be the end of it, that he'd keep quiet if we disappeared and never came back. So we loaded our few possessions on an old horse and headed west, looking for someplace remote enough that the Morrison name would have no power. And you ended up here, Will said, his voice thick with fury at the injustices that had been heaped upon the woman he loved and the daughter he'd never known. We've been here for 3 months, Isabella confirmed, living off what little game I could trap and the few vegetables we managed to grow near the spring. It's been hard, but at least we've been free. At least Luna has been safe. Luna had been listening to her mother's story with the grave attention of a child who was accustomed to adult troubles. Now she looked up at Will with eyes that held a wisdom far beyond her years. Mama always told me that my father was a brave man who had to go away to protect us, she said quietly. She said that someday, when it was safe, maybe we would find each other again. Is it safe now? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with hope and fear in equal measure. Will looked at Isabella, seeing in her face the same desperate longing for safety and stability that he heard in Luna's voice. They had been running and hiding for 20 years, always looking over their shoulders, always afraid that the past would catch up with them and destroy what little peace they had managed to find. I don't know if it's safe, Will said honestly, but I know that I'm not going to let anyone hurt either of you ever again. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, you're under my protection now. Isabella's eyes filled with fresh tears, but this time they seemed to be tears of relief rather than sorrow. Will, you don't understand what you're promising. The Morrison family has connections throughout the territorial government. If they decide to come after us again, then they'll have to come through me, Will said firmly. I've spent 20 years wondering what happened to you. 20 years carrying the guilt of believing I'd somehow failed to protect the woman I loved. I won't make that mistake again. For the first time since their reunion, Isabella smiled. And Will saw in that expression a glimpse of the young woman who had captured his heart so completely 2 decades earlier. But he also saw the strength and resilience that had carried her through years of hardship, the fierce maternal love that had driven her to sacrifice everything for their daughter's safety. There's something else, Isabella said, her voice growing softer. Something I need you to know about Luna. Will looked at his daughter, who was watching her parents with the careful attention of a child trying to understand the complex emotions swirling around her. She has the gift, Isabella said simply. The sight that runs in your family line. She sees things that others miss, understands connections that shouldn't be visible to someone so young. Will felt a chill run down his spine. The gift Isabella referred to was something his Lakota grandmother had spoken of in whispers. A hereditary ability to perceive spiritual truths and see beyond the surface of events. It was considered a great blessing, but also a heavy burden for those who carried it. Is that how she knew to approach me at the mercantile? Will asked. How she recognized something in me that made her trust a complete stranger. Isabella nodded. She told me that night that she'd dreamed about you for weeks before we came to Copper Ridge. She said the spirits showed her a man with sad eyes who would help our family heal. When she saw you on that bench, she knew immediately who you were. Will looked at Luna with new understanding. seeing not just his daughter, but a child who carried within her the spiritual heritage of two ancient peoples. It was a responsibility that would shape her entire life, a gift that would both bless and burden her in ways that were impossible to predict. The question now, Will said slowly, is what we do next. You can't keep living like this, always. Running, always afraid. Luna deserves better. You both deserve better. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, considering possibilities that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. Finally she spoke, her voice filled with a hope she had not dared to feel in 20 years. What are you suggesting? Will took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would commit him to a path from which there could be no turning back. I'm suggesting that we stop running. I'm suggesting that we make a stand, together, as a family. Whatever the Morrison family throws at us, whatever threats they make, we face them united. It's time to reclaim the life that was stolen from us. The decision to stop running marked the beginning of a transformation that none of them could have anticipated. Over the following week, Will threw himself into the task of making Isabella and Luna's camp not just habitable, but genuinely comfortable. He rode into Copper Ridge each morning to purchase supplies and materials, returning each afternoon with lumber for proper shelter construction, food stores that would last through the coming winter, and medical supplies to ensure Isabella's leg healed completely. What surprised him most was how naturally he and Luna fell into the rhythm of father and daughter. The child seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of his moods and preferences, often anticipating his needs before he voiced them. When he struggled to remember the proper technique for constructing a traditional wickiup shelter that would be cooler in summer and warmer in winter, Luna quietly suggested modifications based on techniques her mother had learned from Yaqui women in Sonora. You're building the frame too rigid, Luna observed on the third day, watching Will lash together cottonwood poles with rawhide strips. Mama says the best shelters breathe with the wind instead of fighting it. See how the poles want to bend naturally? If you let them curve a little more, the whole structure will be stronger. Will paused in his work, studying his daughter's face as she spoke. At 7 years old, she possessed an understanding of engineering principles that many grown men never mastered. But more than that, she had inherited his own gift for seeing how things fit together, how individual components could be combined to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Show me, he said, setting down his tools and giving Luna his full attention. For the next hour, father and daughter worked side by side, Luna's small hands guiding Will's larger ones as they adjusted the shelter's framework, according to principles that combined Lakota engineering with adaptations Isabella had learned during their years of wandering. The result was a structure that seemed to grow naturally from the landscape, its curved lines and organic proportions making it appear as though it had always existed beside the hidden spring. Isabella watched them work from her resting place beneath the cottonwoods, and Will could see the wonder in her eyes as she observed the easy partnership that was developing between her daughter and the man who had been absent from their lives for so long. There was healing happening here, not just of Isabella's infected wound, but of the deeper injuries that 20 years of separation had inflicted on all of them. As the shelter neared completion, Will began to understand that Luna's guidance came from more than just practical knowledge. The child seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to sense what would work and what wouldn't, as though she could perceive the underlying harmony that connected all things. It was the gift Isabella had mentioned, the spiritual sight that ran in his family line, manifesting itself in ways that were both practical and profound. Luna, Will said as they secured the final layer of brush and canvas that would make the shelter weatherproof. Your mother tells me you have dreams sometimes. Dreams that show you things before they happen. Luna nodded matter-of-factly, as though prophetic dreams were as natural as breathing. The spirits like to talk when I'm sleeping. They show me pictures of things that might happen, depending on what choices people make. Sometimes the pictures are happy, Sometimes they're scary. Have you had any dreams about us lately? Will asked gently. About our family? Luna was quiet for a moment, her young face serious as she considered how much to reveal. I dreamed about a big house with lots of windows, she said finally, and a garden where I was teaching other children about plants that can heal sick people. In the dream, you and Mama were old and happy, sitting on a porch watching your grandchildren play. The image hit Will with unexpected force. For 20 years, he had convinced himself that his chance for family and continuity had been lost forever. Now hearing Luna describe a future where he and Isabella grew old together, surrounded by the next generation of their bloodline, he felt a longing so intense it was almost painful. That sounds like a beautiful dream, he said softly. Do you think it's one of the ones that might come true? Luna tilted her head, studying him with eyes that seemed far too knowing for her age. That depends on whether you and Mama are brave enough to stop being afraid of being happy. The spirits say that sometimes people get so used to sadness that they forget how to let joy into their hearts. The wisdom of her words stunned Will into silence. This child, who had spent her entire life on the margins of society, who had never known security or stability, was counseling him about the courage required to embrace happiness. It was a reminder that Luna carried within her not just his genetic heritage, but something far more precious, the accumulated wisdom of generations of people who had learned to find hope in the darkest circumstances. That evening, as they sat around their campfire sharing a meal of rabbit stew and cornbread that Isabella had prepared despite her continued weakness, Will found himself studying the faces of his newfound family in the flickering firelight. Isabella's color was returning as her infection responded to proper treatment and regular food. Luna was more animated than he had yet seen her, chattering about plans for expanding their garden and her hopes of someday learning to read the medical books Will had mentioned seeing in town. There's something we need to discuss, Will said when Luna had finally settled down to sleep in the new shelter. About our long-term plans. This camp is fine for now, but winter will be here in a few months. We'll need more substantial shelter, a reliable source of heat, and better access to supplies. Isabella nodded, her expression growing serious. I've been thinking the same thing. But Will, we can't just walk into Copper Ridge and announce that we're setting up permanent residence. People will ask questions. They'll want to know our history, our relationship to each other. Then we tell them the truth, Will said firmly. We're a family that was separated by circumstances beyond our control, and now we've found each other again. It's not uncommon on the frontier. People understand that families get scattered by war, economic hardship, natural disasters. But what about the Morrison connection? Isabella asked, her voice tight with worry. What if word reaches them that we're living openly in Arizona territory? What if they decide to act on those old threats? Will had been giving this question considerable thought over the past week. The Morrison family's power was real, but it was also largely dependent on intimidation and the threat of scandal. If Will, Isabella, and Luna presented themselves as a respectable family with legitimate reasons for their past separation, it would be much harder for the Morrisons to use fabricated charges against them. We get ahead of the story, Will said after a moment. We establish ourselves as valuable members of the community before anyone has reason to question our background. I've been talking to people in town, and there's a real need for someone with medical knowledge. The town doctor is old and unreliable, and there's no one else with training in treating injuries and illnesses. Isabella looked skeptical. You're talking about setting up some kind of medical practice? Well, you're a scout and a tracker, not a physician. No, but I have more medical training than most people on the frontier, Will replied. Years of treating battlefield injuries, dealing with infections, setting broken bones. And you have knowledge of herbal remedies and traditional healing methods. Between us, we could provide better medical care than most frontier towns ever see. The idea was ambitious, perhaps even audacious, but as Will spoke, he could see Isabella beginning to consider the possibilities. They would need to establish credibility quickly, demonstrate their value to the community in ways that would make people protective of them rather than suspicious. There's more, Will continued. Luna's gift, her ability to sense things that others miss, could be invaluable in diagnosing illnesses and understanding what treatments will be most effective. In some cultures, people with her abilities are revered as healers. Isabella's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious hope. You're talking about building a completely new life. A life where we don't have to hide who we are or what we can offer. Exactly, Will said. A life where Luna can grow up knowing she's valued for her gifts instead of having to hide them. A life where we stop apologizing for existing and start contributing to something larger than ourselves. The conversation was interrupted by a sound that made all of them freeze, the distant rhythm of multiple horses approaching through the darkness. In this isolated location, visitors at night usually meant trouble, and Will's hand instinctively moved to the rifle that rested beside his bedroll. "Stay with Luna," he whispered to Isabella, rising silently and moving toward the edge of their campsite where he could observe the approaching riders without being seen. What he saw in the moonlight made his blood run cold. 3 men on horseback, moving with the confident precision of people who were accustomed to intimidating others. Even in the dim light, Will could recognize the military bearing of the lead rider. The expensive tack on the horses, the gleam of weapons carried openly rather than concealed. The riders stopped at the edge of the firelight, and the leader dismounted with the fluid grace of a professional cavalry officer. He was a young man, perhaps 30 years old, with the kind of hard-edged handsomeness that spoke of privilege and education. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mrs. Martinez, I presume," he said, addressing Isabella with mocking courtesy. "I am Lieutenant Robert Morrison, nephew to Colonel James Morrison and cousin to the late Thomas Morrison, whose unfortunate death in Silver Creek has created certain complications." Will felt the pieces of a deadly puzzle clicking into place. Thomas Morrison, the mine foreman who had recognized Isabella and extorted their savings, was dead. And now his family had sent someone to continue whatever schemes he had been pursuing. "Lieutenant Morrison," Isabella said, her voice steady, despite the fear Will could see in her eyes. "I'm sorry for your family's loss, but I don't understand why you've come here." Lieutenant Morrison smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "Oh, I think you understand perfectly. My cousin Thomas wrote to my uncle before his untimely demise, informing him that he had located the Mexican woman who had conspired with enemy Indians 20 years ago. Unfortunately, Thomas died before he could complete the arrangements for your transfer to federal custody." "What arrangements?" Will demanded, stepping into the firelight with his rifle held in a deliberately casual but ready position. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he studied Will's face, taking in the mixed features that marked him as the half-breed scout from his uncle's old reports. "William Black Wolf, I presume. My uncle described you quite thoroughly in his correspondence. You're both under arrest for conspiracy, espionage, and violation of federal treaties regarding Indian-white relations. Those charges are 20 years old and were never formally filed," Will said calmly. "You have no jurisdiction here and no authority to arrest anyone." Morrison's smile widened. "Actually, I have letters of authorization from the territorial governor, signed warrants based on testimony my uncle has been collecting for 2 decades. It seems there were witnesses to your treasonous activities that were never interviewed during the original investigation." Will understood immediately what was happening. The Morrison family had spent 20 years manufacturing evidence, creating a paper trail of false testimony and fabricated documents that would support their original accusations. They had turned Isabella and Will's love story into a conspiracy case that could destroy them both. "However," Morrison continued, his tone becoming almost conversational, "I'm not an unreasonable man. My uncle's primary concern is preventing further embarrassment to the family name. If certain arrangements could be made, certain guarantees given, it might be possible to resolve this matter without involving the federal courts. What kind of arrangements? Isabella asked, though Will could hear in her voice that she already suspected the answer. Morrison's gaze shifted to Luna, who had emerged from the shelter and was standing close to her mother with the wide-eyed alertness of a child who sensed danger. The child, of course. My uncle has done considerable research into her parentage and potential value. A half-breed girl with mixed Mexican and Indian blood, raised in isolation without proper Christian education, represents exactly the Kitsigi kind of salvage opportunity that the Indian schools were designed to address. The threat hit Will like a physical blow. Morrison was talking about taking Luna away, placing her in one of the government boarding schools where Indian children were systematically stripped of their cultural identity and forced to adopt white customs and beliefs. It was cultural genocide, disguised as education, and Will had seen too many children destroyed by the process to allow it to happen to his daughter. "You're not taking her anywhere," Will said, his voice carrying a deadly calm that made Morrison's companions shift nervously in their saddles. "Actually, I am," Morrison replied. "Either voluntarily, as part of our arrangement, or involuntarily, after your arrests and trials. The choice is yours, but the outcome is inevitable." What happened next would later be remembered by Luna as the moment when her father truly returned to their lives. Will's response to Morrison's threat was swift, decisive, and utterly without compromise. Will's movement was fluid and deadly, born from years of frontier survival where hesitation meant death. In one smooth motion, he leveled his rifle at Lieutenant Morrison's chest while simultaneously positioning himself between the mounted soldiers and his family. The weapon's click as he cocked it echoed through the night air like a judge's gavel, final and uncompromising. "You have exactly 10 seconds to mount your horse and ride away," Will said, his voice carrying the cold certainty of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to do so again. "Any attempt to take my daughter will be met with lethal force." Morrison's companions reached for their sidearms, but froze when they realized that Will's position gave him clear shots at all three men while using the campfire's light to his advantage. The lieutenant himself remained motionless, calculating odds with the practiced eye of a career military officer who understood that his current tactical position was untenable. "You're making a grave mistake, Black Wolf," Morrison said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. "Threatening federal officers is a capital offense. You're only making your situation worse." "My situation couldn't be worse," Will replied. "You're threatening to destroy my family based on fabricated evidence and manufactured testimony. I have nothing left to lose, which makes me extremely dangerous to men like you." Luna stepped forward suddenly, moving past her mother's protective arm to stand beside Will. Her small voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. Clear and strangely authoritative despite her youth. "Mr. Morrison, you should listen to what the spirits are showing me about your future," she said, her dark eyes reflecting the firelight in a way that made her appear almost otherworldly. "I see a courtroom where your lies are exposed. I see your uncle in chains, stripped of his rank and his honor. I see you begging for mercy from judges who have learned the truth about what your family has done." Morrison stared at the child with a mixture of fascination and unease. There was something unsettling about the calm certainty with which she spoke, as though she were describing events that had already occurred rather than making predictions about an uncertain future. "Superstitious nonsense," Morrison muttered, but Will noticed that his hand had moved away from his weapon. "Indian mysticism has no place in modern jurisprudence." "Perhaps not," came a new voice from the darkness beyond the campfire's reach. "But testimony from respected members of the territorial government carries considerable weight in any court." Will kept his rifle trained on Morrison while turning his head slightly to identify the speaker. What he saw surprised him. Judge Harold Brewster, the Territorial Circuit Judge, emerging from the shadows accompanied by Sheriff Tom Hawkins and Dr. Elizabeth Cartwright, the territory's only female physician. Morrison's face went pale as he recognized the judge. "Your Honor, I wasn't aware you were in this area. I'm conducting official business under the authority of warrants that don't exist," Judge Brewster interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to cutting through legal pretense and getting to the truth. "I've spent the last 3 days reviewing the territorial records, Lieutenant Morrison. There are no federal warrants for William Black Wolf or Isabella Martinez. There never have been." Dr. Cartwright stepped into the firelight, her professional demeanor commanding immediate attention. She was a woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Her presence here, in this remote location at this crucial moment, seemed too convenient to be coincidental. "Furthermore," Dr. Cartwright added, "I've been investigating reports of medical fraud and extortion related to your cousin Thomas's activities in Silver Creek. It appears the Morrison family has been using fabricated medical emergencies and manufactured crises to extract money and property from vulnerable families throughout the territory." Sheriff Hawkins, a grizzled veteran of frontier law enforcement, moved to flank Morrison's position while keeping his own weapon holstered but ready. "Lieutenant, I'm going to have to ask you and your men to surrender your weapons and submit to questioning regarding multiple allegations of fraud, extortion, and abuse of military authority." Morrison's carefully constructed plan was collapsing around him like a house built on sand. The fabricated warrants, the intimidation tactics, the threats against Luna, all of it was crumbling in the face of legitimate legal authority, backed by evidence of his family's actual crimes. "This is preposterous," Morrison protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "My uncle is a respected military officer with 30 years of distinguished service. These allegations are politically motivated attacks designed to—" "Your uncle," Judge Brewster interrupted coldly, "is currently under investigation by the War Department for a pattern of fraudulent activities spanning 2 decades. It seems Colonel Morrison has been using his position to settle personal vendettas while enriching himself through illegal land acquisitions and government contract manipulation." Will slowly lowered his rifle, though he remained alert and ready. The arrival of legitimate authorities had shifted the balance of power dramatically, but he understood that this confrontation was far from over. Men like Morrison didn't surrender easily, and the Morrison family's reach extended far beyond what these territorial officials might be able to counter. "How did you know to come here?" Will asked Judge Brewster, his tactical mind trying to understand how this rescue had been orchestrated. Dr. Cartwright smiled, and there was something almost maternal in her expression as she looked at Luna. "Your daughter has quite a reputation in town, Mr. Black Wolf. Yesterday, she appeared at my clinic and informed me that her family would need help tonight." She described this confrontation in remarkable detail, including the fact that Lieutenant Morrison would arrive with fabricated federal warrants. Will stared at Luna in amazement. His daughter had not only foreseen this confrontation, but had taken action to ensure that help would arrive at exactly the right moment. The child's gift was even more powerful and practical than he had realized. "Luna told me that the spirits showed her a way to expose the Morrison family's crimes," Dr. Cartwright continued. "She suggested that I contact Judge Brewster and Sheriff Hawkins, and that we review certain territorial records that would reveal the pattern of fraud and extortion." Luna stepped closer to Will, her small hand finding his larger one with the natural trust of a child who had never doubted that her father would protect her. "The spirits said that sometimes the best way to fight darkness is to bring it into the light," she said simply. "They showed me that Mr. Morrison's family has been hurting people for a long time, and that it was time for their lies to be exposed." Morrison's composure finally cracked completely. Faced with the collapse of his schemes and the prospect of his family's crimes being dragged into public scrutiny, he made the kind of desperate move that Will had been expecting. His hand darted toward his sidearm in a last-ditch attempt to salvage the situation through violence. Will's response was immediate and overwhelming. 20 years of frontier survival had honed his reflexes to a razor's edge, and Morrison's clumsy draw was no match for a man who had survived Apache raids, cavalry charges, and countless life-or-death encounters. Will's rifle was back at Morrison's chest before the lieutenant's pistol cleared its holster. "Don't," Will said quietly. "Don't make me kill you in front of my daughter." Sheriff Hawkins moved quickly to disarm Morrison and his companions, his own weapon now drawn and aimed at the mounted soldiers, who had been calculating whether they could support their officers. Desperate gambit. The mathematics of the situation were clear. They were outgunned, outmaneuvered, and facing legitimate law enforcement officers with proper authority. "Robert Morrison," Sheriff Hawkins said formally, "you're under arrest for impersonating federal officers, threatening citizens with fabricated warrants, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Your companions are under arrest as accessories." As the sheriff secured his prisoners, Judge Brewster approached Will and Isabella with an expression that combined official authority with genuine compassion. "Mr. Black-Wolf, Mrs. Martinez, I apologize for the trauma your family has endured. The territorial government takes a very dim view of the kind of abuse of power that the Morrison family has practiced." Isabella stepped forward, her voice steady despite the emotional upheaval of the evening. "Your Honor, what happens now? Are we safe from future retaliation?" Dr. Cartwright answered before the judge could speak. "The investigation into the Morrison family's activities has uncovered enough evidence to ensure that Colonel Morrison will face court-martial and civilian criminal charges. Their ability to threaten anyone has been permanently eliminated. Moreover," Judge Brewster added, "the territorial governor has asked me to extend an official apology to your family on behalf of the government. The injustices you've suffered were the result of criminal conspiracy, not legitimate law enforcement. You have every right to seek compensation for your losses." Will felt a weight lifting from his shoulders that he had carried for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. For 20 years, he had lived with the knowledge that powerful enemies could destroy his life at any moment. Now suddenly, those enemies were facing justice, and his family was finally safe. "There's something else," Dr. Cartwright said, turning to address Will and Isabella together. "Your daughter's insights into my medical cases over the past week have been extraordinary. She's helped me diagnose conditions that I had missed, suggested treatments that proved remarkably effective. I'd like to discuss the possibility of formalizing her training in medical practice." Luna looked up at her parents with eyes that sparkled with excitement. "Dr. Cartwright says I could learn to be a real healer, not just someone who sees things in dreams. She says there are schools back east where women can study medicine, and that my gift would make me special instead of strange." Will exchanged a look with Isabella, seeing in her face the same wonder he felt at how quickly their world was transforming. Just hours ago, they had been fugitives facing the threat of permanent separation. Now they were being offered opportunities that exceeded their wildest dreams. "Dr. Cartwright," Isabella said carefully, "we're grateful for your interest in Luna's education. But we've learned to be cautious about trusting people in positions of authority." "A wise policy," Dr. Cartwright agreed. "Which is why I'm proposing that you consider establishing your own medical practice here in Copper Ridge. The town desperately needs qualified healers, and your combination of traditional knowledge and practical experience would be invaluable. Luna could train with me while learning from both of her parents." The proposal was stunning in its scope and implications. Will had mentioned the possibility of establishing a medical practice, but he had never imagined that the opportunity would be handed to them by respected professionals who understood and valued their unique combination of skills. Moreover, Judge Brewster added, The territorial government is prepared to provide land grants and financial support for medical professionals, willing to serve in underserved communities. Your family's ordeal could become the foundation for a new life that benefits not just you, but everyone in this region. Sheriff Hawkins finished securing his prisoners and approached the group with a grim expression. Mr. Black Wolf, I want you to know that these men will face the full consequences of their actions. But I also want to warn you that the Morrison family has allies and connections that won't disappear overnight. You'll need to remain vigilant. Will nodded, understanding that true safety would require more than just the arrest of 3 men. Sheriff, we appreciate the warning, but my family has been running and hiding for 20 years. We're tired of living in fear. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Luna tugged on Will's hand, drawing his attention down to her upturned face. Papa, the spirits are showing me something new, she said, her voice filled with the kind of quiet certainty that had become familiar over the past week. They say our real adventures are just beginning. They say we're going to help heal not just people's bodies, but the hurt between different peoples who have forgotten how to trust each other. As Will looked around at the unlikely group assembled in their remote camp, a territorial judge, a female physician, a frontier sheriff, and his own reunited family, he began to understand that Luna's vision might be more prophetic than anyone realized. They were standing at the beginning of something larger than personal redemption, something that could reshape the relationships between communities that had been taught to see each other as enemies. The night air carried the sound of horses, as Sheriff Hawkins prepared to transport his prisoners back to town for formal processing. But beneath the practical business of law enforcement, Will sensed the presence of something deeper and more lasting, the possibility that his family's suffering could become the foundation for healing that extended far beyond their own lives. What do you think? Isabella asked quietly, her hand finding his in the darkness. Are you ready to stop running and start building something permanent? Will squeezed her hand, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work and survival, feeling the strength that had carried her through 2 decades of exile and uncertainty. When he answered, his voice carried the conviction of a man who had finally found his way home. I'm ready, he said. We're all ready. 3 months after the confrontation with Lieutenant Morrison, the transformation of Copper Ridge had become the talk of the entire Arizona territory. What had once been a dying mining town with a reputation for lawlessness and desperation was rapidly becoming known as a place where the impossible happened daily, where ancient healing wisdom merged with modern medical practice to create miracles that drew visitors from hundreds of miles away. The Black Wolf Medical Clinic occupied a prime location on Main Street, housed in a building that Will had purchased and extensively renovated with the territorial land grant funds. The structure itself was a testament to the blending of cultures that defined their new life. Traditional adobe construction reinforced with modern timber framing, large windows that captured the desert light while maintaining the cool interior temperatures that made summer work bearable, and a carefully designed layout that accommodated both conventional medical equipment and the ceremonial space needed for Luna's growing practice of spiritual healing. Isabella had thrown herself into the work of establishing their medical practice with the fierce determination of a woman who had spent too many years merely surviving and was finally able to build something lasting. Her knowledge of herbal remedies, gained from years of learning from Yaqui healers and refined through necessity during their wandering years, had proven invaluable in treating conditions that conventional medicine struggled to address. Patients traveled from mining camps and ranches throughout the region, seeking her treatments for everything from chronic pain to fertility problems. But it was Luna who had become the true miracle of Copper Ridge. At 7 years old, she possessed diagnostic abilities that surpassed those of physicians with decades of training. Her gift manifested in ways that were both mystical and intensely practical. She could sense the spiritual and emotional roots of physical ailments, identify infections before they became visible, and predict which treatments would be most effective for individual patients. More importantly, she had learned to communicate her insights in ways that didn't frighten people who might be suspicious of Indian mysticism. "Mrs. Henderson," Luna said gently to an elderly woman who had traveled 50 miles seeking treatment for severe arthritis, "your joints hurt worse when you're worried about your grandson fighting in the Philippines. The pain lives in your heart. First, then it moves to your hands and knees. Dr. Cartwright's medicine will help. But you also need to write letters to your grandson and tell him how proud you are of him." Will watched from across the clinic as Luna worked, marveling at how naturally she had adapted to her role as a healer. The child who had once been forced to hide her abilities now used them openly to bring relief to suffering people. And her reputation for miraculous cures was drawing attention from medical professionals throughout the Southwest. Dr. Cartwright had become not just a mentor to Luna, but a true partner in establishing new approaches to frontier medicine. The collaboration between the traditionally trained physician and the spiritually gifted child had produced treatment protocols that were being studied by medical schools in Chicago and Boston. Letters arrived weekly from doctors and researchers, asking for detailed accounts of cases that seemed to defy conventional understanding. "William," Dr. Cartwright said, approaching him as he organized medical supplies in the clinic's main treatment room, "I've received another letter from Johns Hopkins Medical School. They're offering Luna a full scholarship to their program, with the understanding that she would begin formal medical training at age 14 instead of the usual 18. Will paused in his work, considering the implications of such an offer. The opportunity was extraordinary, potentially life-changing for Luna and revolutionary for the field of medicine. But it would also mean sending his daughter away from her family, just as they were finally learning to be together. "What does Luna think about it?" Will asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "She says the spirits have shown her a different path," Dr. Cartwright replied with a smile. "She wants to establish a healing school here in Copper Ridge, where she can train other children who have similar gifts while developing new approaches that combine traditional wisdom with modern medical science." The idea was ambitious beyond anything Will had imagined, but as he considered it, he began to see the revolutionary potential. A school that could train healers in both spiritual and scientific approaches to medicine could transform healthcare throughout the frontier regions, bringing effective treatment to communities that had never had access to qualified medical care. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices from the street outside. Through the clinic's large windows, Will could see a crowd gathering around a familiar figure, Father Miguel Santos, the Catholic priest who served the Mexican communities throughout the region. The priest was gesturing animatedly while speaking to a group of ranchers and miners, his voice carrying the kind of righteous anger that suggested he was delivering a sermon rather than having a conversation. "What's that about?" Dr. Cartwright asked, moving to the window for a better view. Will's expression darkened as he caught fragments of Father Santos's speech. The priest was condemning the Black Wolf Clinic as a center of pagan practices and spiritual corruption, warning the gathered men that allowing Indian mysticism to masquerade as legitimate medicine would bring divine punishment upon the entire community. "It's about us," Will said grimly. "Father Santos has been building opposition to our work for weeks. He sees Luna's healing gifts as competition for the church's spiritual authority." Isabella emerged from the clinic's herb preparation room, her arms covered in dust from grinding medicinal plants into powders and tinctures. She took one look at the crowd outside and immediately understood the situation. "How bad is it?" she asked, joining Will and Dr. Cartwright at the window. "Bad enough," Will replied. "Santos has been telling people that Luna's abilities come from demonic sources, that anyone who accepts treatment from us is endangering their immortal souls. Some of the Mexican families have stopped bringing their children here, even when they're seriously ill. The religious opposition to their work was particularly painful because it targeted the very communities that had historically been most marginalized by conventional medical establishments. Mexican and Indian families had been among their most grateful patients, people who understood the value of healing approaches that addressed spiritual as well as physical ailments. Now they were being forced to choose between their religious beliefs and their children's health. Luna appeared beside them with the silent grace that had become her trademark, her young face serious as she studied the crowd outside. "Father Santos is afraid," she said quietly. "He thinks that if people learn they can heal themselves and each other, they won't need him anymore. But he's wrong. Healing bodies and healing souls are different kinds of work, and both are important. Can you help him understand that?" Isabella asked her daughter. "Can you show him that your gift comes from the same source as his faith?" Luna tilted her head, considering the question with the gravity of a much older person. "The spirits say he's not ready to listen yet. His fear is too strong. But they also say that something will happen soon that will change his mind." Before anyone could ask Luna to elaborate on her cryptic prediction, the clinic door burst open and young Tommy Garrett, the mercantile owner's son, stumbled inside bleeding heavily from a deep gash across his forehead. Behind him came his father, carrying a second boy who appeared to be unconscious. "Help us," Mr. Garrett shouted. "There's been an accident at the mine. A support beam collapsed." Tommy got out, but Billy Santos is hurt bad. Will felt his blood freeze as he realized that the unconscious boy was Father Santos's nephew, a child who had been forbidden from seeking treatment at their clinic. The priest's religious objections were about to collide with every parent's worst nightmare, watching a child suffer while refusing the help that might save him. Dr. Cartwright immediately took charge of the medical emergency, her professional training overriding any concerns about religious politics. "Get Billy onto the examination table," she ordered. "Isabella, I need clean water and carbolic solution. William, help me assess his injuries." Luna moved to Tommy Garrett's side, her small hands glowing with a soft light that seemed to emanate from her palms as she placed them gently on his wounded forehead. "You're going to be fine," she told him with quiet certainty. "The cut looks scary, but it's not deep enough to cause lasting damage. Dr. Cartwright will clean it and stitch it, and by next week you'll only have a thin scar that the girls will think makes you look brave." Tommy's panic immediately subsided as Luna's healing energy flowed into him, his breathing becoming steady and his color returning to normal. It was a demonstration of her gift that was both subtle and profound, showing how spiritual healing could work alongside conventional medical treatment to address not just physical trauma but the fear and shock that often accompanied serious injuries. Meanwhile, Dr. Cartwright's examination of Billy Santos revealed injuries that were far more serious than Tommy's. The boy had suffered a severe concussion and showed signs of internal bleeding that could prove fatal without immediate surgical intervention. It was exactly the kind of medical emergency that pushed frontier healthcare beyond its normal capabilities. "We need to operate immediately," Dr. Cartwright announced grimly. "There's bleeding in his abdomen that won't stop on its own. But I have to warn you, Mr. Garrett, the procedure is risky, and I've never attempted abdominal surgery without a full surgical team." "Do whatever you have to do," Mr. Garrett said desperately. "Billy's like family to us. His uncle will never forgive any of us if we let him die." Luna stepped forward, her young voice cutting through the adult panic with startling authority. "Dr. Cartwright, I can help guide the surgery. The spirits are showing me exactly where the bleeding is and how to stop it. But you have to trust me completely, even when what I tell you doesn't match what you learned in medical school." Dr. Cartwright stared at the 7-year-old girl who was offering to assist with life-or-death surgery, weighing decades of medical training against her growing understanding of Luna's extraordinary abilities. In any normal circumstance, the idea would be unthinkable. But Billy Santos was dying, and conventional approaches had already reached their limits. "Tell me what you see," Dr. Cartwright said finally, making the decision to trust Luna's gift. Completely. What followed was the most remarkable surgical procedure in the history of Arizona Territory medicine. Luna stood beside the operating table with her eyes closed. Her consciousness expanded into the spiritual realm where she could perceive the flow of life energy through Billy's injured body. She guided Dr. Cartwright's hands with whispered instructions that seemed to come from a source of knowledge far beyond her 7 years of life experience. 2 inches to the left, then angle the scalpel toward his spine, Luna murmured, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. The bleeding is coming from a torn vessel that you can't see yet, but it's right there beneath the muscle wall. Dr. Cartwright followed Luna's guidance with the precision of a surgeon who had learned to trust her instruments completely. When her scalpel found the hidden source of bleeding, exactly where Luna had predicted, she understood that she was witnessing something that would revolutionize her understanding of medical practice. The surgery continued for 2 hours, with Luna providing supernatural guidance while Will and Isabella assisted with conventional medical support. By the time they finally closed Billy's incisions, all 4 adults were exhausted, but the boy's vital signs had stabilized and his color was returning to normal. "He's going to live," Dr. Cartwright announced, her voice filled with wonder at what they had accomplished together. Not only live, but recover completely. "I've never seen anything like it." Luna swayed on her feet, the spiritual effort of guiding the surgery having drained her more completely than any physical exertion ever could. Will caught her as she began to fall, lifting his daughter into his arms and marveling at the courage she had shown in using her gift to save another child's life. "I'm okay, Papa," Luna whispered, though her face was pale with exhaustion. Billy needed help, and the spirits knew how to give it to him. Sometimes being different means you can do things that other people can't. The clinic door opened again, and Father Santos entered with the desperate urgency of a man who had heard that his nephew was dying. He stopped short when he saw Billy, resting peacefully on the examination table, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of healthy sleep. "Is he?" the priest began, unable to finish the question. "He's going to be fine," Dr. Cartwright assured him. The surgery was successful, thanks to some very special assistance. Father Santos looked around the room, taking in the medical equipment, the herbal preparations, and finally focusing on Luna, who was still resting in her father's arms. For a long moment, the priest struggled with emotions that seemed to war with his previously held convictions. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "All of you. I let my fear and prejudice blind me to the good work you're doing here. What you've done for Billy, what you do for all the families in this region, it's not the work of demons. It's the work of angels." Luna lifted her head from Will's shoulder, studying the priest with eyes that seemed to see directly into his soul. "Father Santos, your faith and my gift come from the same place. We're both trying to help people find healing and hope. Maybe we could work together instead of against each other." The priest knelt beside Will, bringing himself to Luna's eye level. "Child, would you teach me about your gift? Would you help me understand how to support families who are struggling with both spiritual and physical suffering?" Luna's smile was radiant as she nodded. "The spirits say that when healers work together, they can help more people than any of them could help alone. I'd like that very much." As Will watched Father Santos take Luna's small hand in both of his, he realized that they had crossed another threshold in their journey toward building the kind of community they had always dreamed of. The opposition that had threatened to divide their work along religious and cultural lines was being transformed into collaboration that could strengthen their healing mission beyond anything they had imagined possible. 2 years had passed since Father Santos's dramatic conversion from opponent to ally, and the transformation of Copper Ridge had exceeded even Luna's most optimistic prophetic visions. What had begun as a simple medical clinic had evolved into something unprecedented in the American Southwest, a comprehensive healing center that attracted patients, students, and researchers from across the continent, all drawn by reports of Miraculous cures and revolutionary approaches to medicine that seemed to bridge the gap between science and spirituality. The Black Wolf Institute for Integrative Medicine now occupied an entire city block. Its adobe and timber buildings designed to accommodate not just medical treatment, but also research facilities, teaching classrooms, and residential quarters. For the growing number of students who came to study under Luna's guidance, the architectural style had become known throughout the territory as Copper Ridge Fusion, blending Lakota, Mexican, and Anglo building traditions into structures that seemed to grow naturally from the desert landscape while incorporating the most advanced medical equipment available. Will stood on the observation deck of the Institute's main building, watching the morning activities unfold in the courtyard below. Young healers from dozens of different tribal nations worked alongside conventionally trained medical students, sharing knowledge that had been kept separate for centuries. Mexican curanderas demonstrated herbal preparation techniques to doctors from Harvard Medical School, while Lakota medicine men taught diagnostic ceremonies to nurses from the Mayo Clinic in Rochester. "It's hard to believe sometimes," Isabella said, joining him on the deck with 2 cups of coffee and the kind of contented smile that had become her trademark over the past 2 years. "When Luna was little, I used to worry that her gift would make her an outcast. Now she's teaching the world that being different can be the greatest strength of all." Through the large windows below, they could see Luna working with her latest class of advanced students. At 9 years old, she had become the youngest person in history to be granted an honorary doctorate from Johns Hopkins Medical School. But more importantly, she had developed teaching methods that could help other gifted children learn to use their abilities in service of healing rather than hiding them in shame or fear. "Mrs. Thompson," Luna was saying to a 12-year-old Navajo girl who had recently joined the program, "your ability to sense emotional trauma in physical symptoms is incredibly valuable. When you touch Mr. Garcia's shoulder and feel sadness, that tells us his back pain might be related to grief over his wife's death last year. Regular medicine might only treat the physical symptoms, but we can help heal the underlying cause." The girl nodded seriously, her young face reflecting the same combination of wisdom and innocence that had marked Luna's own development. Watching the next generation of healers learn to embrace their gifts filled Will with a pride that went beyond personal satisfaction. They were literally changing the world, one student at a time. Dr. Cartwright emerged from the research laboratory, her arms full of reports and correspondence that had arrived on the morning train. Her role had evolved from small-town physician to internationally recognized pioneer in the field of integrative medicine. But she had never lost the practical focus that made her such an effective partner in their work. "We've received formal recognition from the American Medical Association," she announced, holding up an official document with obvious satisfaction. "The Institute is now accredited to grant medical degrees, which means our graduates will be able to practice anywhere in the United States. More importantly, we've been invited to present our research findings at the International Congress of Medicine in Vienna next year." The recognition represented a triumph that none of them could have imagined during those early days, when they were struggling simply to survive. The same medical establishment that had once dismissed spiritual healing as primitive superstition was now acknowledging that the Institute's approaches produced better outcomes than conventional treatments for many conditions. "There's more," Dr. Cartwright continued, her excitement evident. "The Department of Indian Affairs has asked us to establish satellite schools on reservations throughout the Southwest. They finally realized that traditional healing knowledge represents a valuable resource that should be preserved and integrated with modern medical practice rather than suppressed." Father Santos appeared in the courtyard below, leading a group of visitors on what had become a regular tour of the Institute's facilities. The priest's transformation from religious opponent to enthusiastic supporter had been so complete that he now served as the Institute's liaison with various Christian denominations, helping to overcome theological objections to spiritual healing. practices, and here, they could hear him saying to the tour group, "We see how prayer and traditional ceremony can work together with surgical procedures to achieve healing that addresses both body and soul." Last month, Luna and Dr. Cartwright performed a heart operation on a Hopi elder who had been given up for dead by physicians in Phoenix. Not only did he survive, but his recovery time was less than half what medical textbooks would predict. The tour group included several familiar faces, territorial officials, representatives from medical schools, and wealthy philanthropists who had been drawn to support the Institute's work. But Will's attention was caught by three figures who stood slightly apart from the main group, observing everything with the careful attention of people who were evaluating rather than simply learning. "Isabella," Will said quietly, "do you recognize those men near the fountain? The ones in the expensive suits?" Isabella followed his gaze and immediately tensed. "The tall one in the center looks familiar, but I can't place him. Why? Do you think they're trouble?" Before Will could answer, Luna appeared on the observation deck with the silent grace that had become her trademark. Her young face was serious, marked by the kind of concern that usually preceded important revelations. "Papa, Mama," she said. Without preamble, "Those men are from Washington. They're government officials who want to take control of the Institute and use it for political purposes. The spirits are showing me that they have plans that would destroy everything we've built." Here, Will felt the familiar chill of recognition. Throughout their journey, moments of greatest triumph had often been followed by new threats from people who wanted to exploit or control their work. It seemed that success had made them a target for a different kind of danger. "What kind of plans?" Isabella asked, her protective instincts immediately alert. Luna's expression grew distant as she accessed the spiritual realm where her prophetic gifts operated most clearly. "They want to use our healing methods to create super soldiers for the military. They think that if they can understand how spiritual healing works, they can make warriors who recover from injuries faster and fight longer without getting tired. They don't understand that healing energy can't be used for violence without destroying itself." The implications of Luna's vision were staggering. The federal government's interest in militarizing their work represented exactly the kind of corruption that could destroy not just the Institute, but the entire movement toward integrative medicine that they had worked so hard to establish. Dr. Cartwright had overheard Luna's warning and immediately joined their conference on the observation deck. "If what Luna is seeing is accurate, we need to prepare for a fight that could determine the future of everything we've accomplished here. How do we protect the Institute from being transformed into a weapons research facility? We don't fight them," Luna said with the calm certainty that marked her most important pronouncements. "We show them a better way. The spirits are telling me that these men are here because they're afraid. There are rumors of war coming, and they think that better soldiers are the answer. But what the world really needs is better healing." Will studied his daughter's face, marveling at how her gift continued to evolve in directions that none of them could have predicted. At 9 years old, she was already thinking in terms of global politics and international consequences, understanding that their work had implications far beyond the individual patients they treated. "What are you proposing?" he asked. "I want to show them what happens when healing spreads instead of violence," Luna replied. "Tomorrow, representatives from 12 different countries are arriving to study our methods. What if we demonstrate that teaching people to heal each other is more powerful than teaching them to hurt each other? What if we prove that the best way to win wars is to prevent them from starting?" The idea was audacious in its scope and implications. Luna was suggesting that they use the next day's international conference not just to share medical knowledge, but to launch a global movement that could fundamentally change how nations approached conflict resolution. Isabella reached out to stroke her daughter's hair, her eyes filled with the kind of maternal pride that came from watching a child grow beyond every expectation. "Mia, are you sure you're ready for that kind of responsibility? What you're talking about could change the entire world." "The world is going to change anyway, Mama," Luna replied with startling maturity. "The spirits show me pictures of terrible wars coming in the next few decades, conflicts that will hurt millions of people unless someone finds a different way. Maybe we can't stop all the fighting, but we can show people that there are better choices." The conference that began the next morning exceeded everyone's expectations in both scope and significance. Delegates from European medical schools, representatives from Asian healing traditions, and observers from indigenous communities throughout the Americas gathered in the Institute's main auditorium to witness demonstrations that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of healing and human potential. Luna's presentation was the centerpiece of the entire event. Standing before an audience that included some of the most distinguished medical professionals in the world, she demonstrated diagnostic abilities that seemed to transcend the limitations of conventional examination techniques. More importantly, she showed how spiritual healing could be taught to others, creating a multiplier effect that could transform healthcare delivery in regions where medical resources were scarce. "Dr. Mueller," Luna said, addressing a skeptical German physician who had publicly questioned the scientific validity of spiritual healing, "you're suffering from chronic pain in your left knee that conventional medicine hasn't been able to cure. The injury happened when you were 12 years old and fell from a horse, but the real problem isn't physical damage. It's guilt you've carried for 30 years because you blamed yourself for your younger brother's death in the same accident." The auditorium fell silent as Dr. Muller's face went pale with shock. No one in America could possibly have known about the childhood tragedy that had shaped his entire career in medicine. Yet this 9-year-old girl had identified not just his physical symptoms, but their emotional roots with stunning accuracy. "If you're willing," Luna continued gently, "I can help you release that guilt and allow your knee to heal completely. But first, you need to understand that your brother's death wasn't your fault, and that the pain you've been carrying isn't honoring his memory. It's preventing you from becoming the healer he would have wanted you to be." What followed was a healing demonstration that left the entire international audience speechless. As Luna worked with Dr. Mueller, guiding him through a process that combined spiritual counseling with energy healing, his chronic pain disappeared completely for the first time in 3 decades. More importantly, the rigid skepticism that had defined his professional approach began to soften into something approaching wonder. "This is impossible according to everything I learned in medical school," Dr. Mueller admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can't deny what I'm experiencing. The pain is gone, but more than that, I feel lighter, as though a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying has been lifted from my shoulders." The government officials who had come to evaluate the Institute's military potential found themselves witnessing something far different from what they had expected. Instead of demonstrations of enhanced physical performance or accelerated healing for combat injuries, they saw evidence of human capabilities that could transform international relations through empathy and understanding rather than force and intimidation. "General Harrison," Luna said, turning to address the senior military official in the audience, "you came here hoping to find ways to make soldiers stronger and more resilient. But the spirits are showing me that what your country really needs is leaders who can heal divisions instead of creating them. Would you like me to show you what that kind of leadership looks like?" The general's response revealed the internal conflict that Luna's presence created in people who were accustomed to thinking in terms of power and control rather than healing and cooperation. "Young lady, I'm not sure what you're suggesting, but my responsibility is to protect American interests through military strength. I understand," Luna replied with the patient wisdom that had become her trademark. "But what if protecting American interests meant teaching other countries to trust America instead of fear it? What if the strongest military was one that never had to fight, because it had helped create a world where conflicts were resolved through healing rather than violence?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled military and government officials had been taught. about national security and international relations. But as they watched Luna continue to demonstrate healing abilities that seemed to transcend the limitations of conventional understanding, some of them began to consider possibilities they had never imagined. The conference concluded with the signing of the Copper Ridge Accords, an international agreement to establish healing institutes in major cities throughout the world, all modeled on the principles that Luna and her family had developed. The document represented more than just medical cooperation. It was a commitment to approaching human conflicts through understanding and healing, rather than force and domination. As the last of the international delegates departed, Will found himself alone with Isabella and Luna on the observation deck, where so many important conversations had taken place over the past 2 years. The sunset painted the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, and for the first time in months, they could simply be a family rather than public figures representing a global movement. "What happens now?" Isabella asked, her arm linked. Through Wilsus they watched Luna feed seeds to the doves that had taken up residence around the institute. "Now we keep growing," Luna said without looking up from her birds. "The spirits are showing me healing centers in every major city, places where people from different cultures can learn from each other. They're showing me children like me, kids, who used to hide their gifts, now becoming teachers and healers. Most of all, they're showing me a world where being different isn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated." Will pulled both his wife and daughter close, marveling at how far they had traveled from that desperate moment, when a little girl had asked a stranger to buy medicine for her dying mother. The journey that had begun with a simple act of compassion had grown into something that was reshaping the world's understanding of human potential and the power of healing to transform not just individual lives, but entire civilizations. "And 20 years from now?" he asked Luna, curious about her visions of their distant future. Luna smiled, her young face radiant with the kind of certainty that came from seeing beyond the limitations of present circumstances. 20 years from now, people will look back on this time as the beginning of the great healing, when humanity learned that our differences are our greatest strength, and that love really can conquer fear. And somewhere in all of that, there will be a little girl with her father's eyes and her mother's courage, asking a stranger for help, not knowing that she's about to change the world all over again. As the stars emerged in the desert sky above Copper Ridge, Will understood that their story was far from over. It was simply the first chapter in a much larger tale, one that would be written by all the children like Luna, who would learn that their gifts were not burdens to be hidden, but lights to be shared with a world that desperately needed healing. And in that realization, he found the deepest satisfaction of all, the knowledge that their love had created something eternal, something that would continue to grow and heal long after they were gone.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.